Now, I'd like to share with you what I've learned over the past 25 years, more than 200 capital campaigns, more than $200 million. It's a lot of information. I probably got 8 hours worth of stuff to share with you. So I want to focus it because we've only got about 45 or 50 minutes, and I've scheduled 2 experts to join me that I'll interview, and you can benefit from their many decades of experience as well. So this is me, Denis Greene. I've really actually been at this for more than 30 years. I began in 1982 with an organization that served all kinds of nonprofit organizations. And then in 1992, I started church development after being in a car wreck, spending 7 months in traction, laying there in prayer, thinking, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And in retrospect, I have to say, that was the best car wreck of my life. It caused introspection, thoughtfulness, and discernment, and church development has been the result. And I've really enjoyed it. It's how I met my wife, many friends. We get a lot of repeat clients, so I've known people across decades because of my professional work with them. And it's just been a pleasure. It's helped me in my spiritual life. Now, I've written up what I've learned in a book called The Stewardship System. If you send me a note, I'll send you that book. I've got 4 kids. My wife is also a church nerd. She teaches theology. I'm also very interested in innovation. I read a lot in that world. Church development was founded in 1992. Our mission is to increase generosity without fundraising. That's an unusual blend. That's because stewardship and fundraising are not the same thing. Fundraising is an exchange. It's a subset of marketing. But stewardship is discerning how God's blessings might flow through me. And that's fundamentally different from the trade. God has given us all that we have, and we need to be grateful and really figure out how to share and pass on that which God has given us. Very different from a trade or a purchase. If you look at our church development website, you'll see a little bit more about us. They're down at the bottom of the screen. You see a welcome from me and a story about our beginning, which really began in 1979 when I took a float trip down the Congo River, ended up in an Angolan war zone and had a gun to my head. It's the first time I really ever prayed and meant it, but it resulted in my personal conversion experience. Years later, I had another challenge, cancer. I found that by my daughter accidentally kicked me in the gut. She was doing a cartwheel through the dining room, kicked me in the gut. It hurt so bad. I went to the doctor. He said, hey, we've got a tumor there. We got to do surgery immediately. In retrospect, I was very lucky to be the recipient of that kick. It saved my life. The stewardship system we developed as a gift to you, we offer that free to churches. They've got to deliberately subscribe because we're not going to spam people about this. But if you subscribe, you get a monthly update with readings, or a stewardship column that is corresponding with the readings of the day that you can cut and paste in your bulletin. It has committee agendas, checklists, timelines, calendars, solicitation letters, thank you notes, newsletters, brochures, pledge cards, virtually everything you need to run an annual campaign. To do it yourself, it would really cost maybe $15,000, $20,000 a year to employ a staff person to create that. So it's a wonderful resource. I just love it. You can see in your bar, and forgive me again, I'm technologically pretty weak here, but the bar at the top, you can share your questions and answers. Let me ask Meredith. Meredith, what's the button that they push?
Q&A, or
there you
available
go.
over chat.
The Q&A. Just press that. And as we begin, I would like to know, what would you like to get out of today's workshop? Tell me something wonderful that God has blessed you with. And tell me, what would you like to get out of today? I've got my handy dandy pen and my pad, and I'm ready to write down and respond to your questions. But we will move pretty quickly through this. So please direct your questions and I'll respond and weave my answers into what the material is that we'll be covering. Here's the agenda. First, what's a capital campaign? We'll cover that just very quickly in case you don't know. There are a handful of ways you can look at a capital campaign. We're going to cover 3 case studies. I've asked Marthame Sanders a retired pastor, to join us to give us perspective on 3 different churches that he has worked with. Then we're going to go to the 4 parts that are the meat of this workshop. Number 1, in preparing for a capital campaign, the first thing you have to do is work on consensus about your church vision. And then you've got to find the financial data to support that, so you know what you're getting into. Number 2, you've got to create a culture of stewardship, which takes a little bit of work. Without that culture of stewardship, you run the danger that your annual campaign could take a dip during your capital campaign. So about 99% of the time, we do not have that problem. But if you do not have a culture of stewardship, you run that risk. Number 3, we're going to talk about a feasibility study, and that is your market research. So we ask people for their input in the planning process. I will show you both the results and recommendations that come out of a real-life feasibility study we've done in the last year for a $3.2 million capital campaign. That also resulted in an increase in annual giving of 20%, so it's pretty exciting. And then number 4, we'll talk about your leadership team, because you can't do this alone. You really got to have pastoral leadership, lay leadership, and staff leadership, all involved in doing the most important thing in this capital campaign, and that is tailoring the capital campaign to the unique personality of your church. So one size does not fit all. Let me rephrase that. You could run a cookie cutter approach. You could do nothing of what I suggest, but the correlation is that you will raise less money. So I'm going to recommend that you be very deliberate in tailoring this to the unique needs of your church, because if you do, you can raise 3 times annual giving. So you can do the math right now and think of, well, what's my annual giving to my church? Multiply that times 3, 300%. That is within your grasp. Now, our norm over the past 250 churches is that we've raised about 2.5 times annual giving. That is our norm. Now, we keep track of churches that do not do anything that we recommend. And what we've discovered is that on average, we raise 5 times more than a church that just asks for pledges. So there is a real financial benefit to following our recommendations, and I will get really specific on how you can maximize your success. Recently, we just had a capital campaign where we raised 7 times annual giving. You do the math for your annual giving, that's an enormous amount of money. Now, we'll also cover, before we conclude, when to do a capital campaign and when to not do a capital campaign. And we'll wrap up with specific details on what are your specific next steps. So let's begin. What's a capital campaign? It's a special need. It is different from an annual campaign. It's different from a special event. It's different from an endowment campaign or an emergency. Capital campaign has a life of its own. Our norm is to raise 2.5 times annual giving and 3-year pledges. It's very rare that we would do a campaign with 2-year pledges. We've done maybe 1 in the last 10 years. It's equally rare that we do a campaign with 5-year pledges. What we discovered was that we could raise the same amount of money in a 3-year campaign as we would in a 5-year campaign. So we decided we should just stick with a 3-year capital campaign. And think about it, over 6 years, you could do 2 capital campaigns versus over 5 years, you could do 1 campaign and get ready for a second campaign. Now, the great thing in the mind of the donors is that it has a beginning and it has an ending. It is a discrete, specific unit. And therefore, in the mind of the donors, I will be able to increase my giving because there is an end in sight. That's a real critical distinction. So we work on a lot of annual campaigns. Matter of fact, when I interview Marthame here in about 5 minutes, he'll tell us a story about 2 annual campaigns that he ran that he had fantastic increases. But a fantastic increase is 10 to 20%. It's rare that we would get people to double in their annual giving. Now, capital campaign, because it's been studied a great deal, we collect a lot of data about capital campaigns. I'm always asked, How much is it going to cost? The rule of thumb is it costs less than 10% of that which you raise. So if you raise $1 million, it's going to cost you less than $100,000. Now, $100,000 is still a lot of money, but you can kind of shift the way you think about that, and you can apply business person thinking. You could say, well, our return on investment is 10 to 1, $10 for every dollar that we invest. And that is a good ROI. Don't you wish you could do that with your retirement funds? Now, capital campaign usually takes about 6 months from beginning to end. We've done them in 4 months and we've done them in 12 months, but the median is about 6 months. There's a trend that has emerged over the past 15 years, which churches are now doing a capital campaign every 5 years. So it generally looks like this. You first build a culture of stewardship. You get consensus on your vision. You do a feasibility study. You do 3 years of capital campaign pledges. Then you take a year off and you go start the cycle back over again. Now, a lot of people are worried, is this going to affect our annual giving? Well, not necessarily. If you have a strong culture of stewardship, your annual giving will increase. So not only will your annual giving increase, but you'll receive a bunch of planned gifts as well. So it seems to be a win-win opportunity. Now let me right now patch in Marthame Sanders. He's going to help us walk through a couple of case studies. Earlier, I referred to him as my retired professional friend. Hi, Marthame.
Hey, Dennis.
How you doing, buddy?
I'm great. Just watching the snow melt in Atlanta.
Okay, so Marthame, let me ask you a couple of questions as we walk through these case studies. So here are the 4 questions that I'm going to ask you. How did you, Marthame, develop consensus? How did you develop a culture of stewardship? How did you conduct your feasibility study? And what did you get out of that? And then the 4th question is, what did your leadership team look like, sound like, and act like? What did they do?
Right.
So we're going to begin with the church where you were a pastor, which is my memory right, that was 2012?
It was 2012. You are right. We launched a 3-year campaign in 2012, Oglethorpe Presbyterian Church here in Atlanta. And we worked with church development from the get-go. And a big part of the consensus was working with church development and working with our leadership team to decide what were the things that we most needed to do that required money that we couldn't normally raise in an annual giving campaign. And
okay, so what I'm hearing you say, it was more than just your decision.
Absolutely. Okay. We needed wisdom from the rest of the leadership. We needed to have a shared buy-in from not just leadership, but from the broader community, from the congregation.
Okay, all right, so I've got a picture on the screen here of consensus, a whole bunch of people sitting in a circle, in a kind of a tribal circle, and I'm going to assume that you participated in a lot of dialogue in that consensus building process.
We've done a ton of small group stuff. We did some one-on-ones. We did some large group things. We did, the feasibility study was a big chunk of it, obviously, which we'll get to in number 3, but really soliciting ideas and opinions and realizing very quickly that what we needed to focus on was a deferred maintenance campaign. An old building that needed upkeep.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what was your driving motivation and what were the results. I have your brochure right here ahead of me. And as I flip to that middle page, am I correct that this is what you had consensus on?
This is what we had consensus on, yeah.
Okay. And as I remember, it was a challenge because it was not very exciting. The delayed maintenance issues were not the most appealing thing.
Yeah, HVAC and fixing doors and building bathrooms are not the sexiest items you're going to get out of a capital campaign. But because we recognized that this was something that we needed to do, and there was good energy around the life of the congregation, these were kind of no-brainers. But we didn't have, prior to this, we didn't have a culture of generosity. We didn't have a culture of stewardship. We did an annual campaign where we asked people for pledges, and then we said thank you.
Okay. And so before we move to your culture of stewardship, would you mind just touching on the highlights of your facility plans? You know, I
Sure.
see these 1, 2, 3, 4. The one I'm real interested in is this one right here. That outreach is
Yeah.
not a facility plan.
Correct.
So I like thinking of 90% towards facilities, 10% towards outreach and marketing. But what was it for you?
So we were very aware that we needed to do a better job with outreach, evangelism. Creating a culture of invitation was the phrase that we ended up developing. So we had to do the maintenance because the HVAC was going to be toast within a matter of weeks. The
Really?
roof was leaking. We were having all of these issues that we needed to address immediately. And once we addressed those, we recognized that we were behind the curve on reaching out to our community and connecting with our community. Because it was not a bricks and mortar piece, that was probably the piece that was hardest to build into the campaign. And yet the reality is, and as I came to understand it, obviously, that a capital campaign is there to raise capital. That is money.
Right.
There's nothing sacrosanct about it being for bricks and mortar, though bricks and mortar tends to be more energizing.
Right.
And
Right,
what
right.
we
It's
just
a lot more exciting. They can see
Yeah.
where they're going. Right.
Yeah, and the process that we went through, like you talked about, those dialogues and those small group meetings and so on, was one where we then could present this plan, which included these different things, and ask people for their opinions. What do you think? Do we have them right? Are our priorities in order? And I remember the very first meeting we had, we got tremendous pushback on this outreach item.
Really?
For the very things that you're talking about, to the point that the leadership team was almost ready to throw in the towel and say, you know what, we're not going to do it. We're going to do everything else.
No kidding.
And we were working with a church development consultant, Ed Dobmeyer, who we refer to lovingly as Yoda around the office.
Yoda.
For his calm wisdom.
And I, the Jedi.
And I, the Jedi. And Ed talked us off the ledge and said, this is a process. Let it take its course. And he, of course, was right and wise. And the reality was that people had their concerns heard. We addressed them. We talked very directly and bluntly and transparently about why we were doing outreach. And it became an integral part of the campaign.
Okay, so you're really doing that which is portrayed right here on this picture. It's a dialogue. Exactly. It is not so chaos is part of it. So it's not
chaos is part of it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Especially if you haven't done it before.
Right, right. And for most churches, this is a very rare thing to create a vision by getting everyone's input.
Yep.
Now, I remember you and I years ago talked about Scott Peck, the guy who wrote The Road Less Traveled. And I think you told me that he wrote a book called The Different Drum about building community. And in that, he said the single greatest thing you could do to build the strength of your community is to do what's portrayed in this picture, discuss and create consensus around our vision.
Yeah.
So you were a success. I mean, you did really well. And so tell me this, how did you do financially? What was your multiple of income? What multiple of annual giving did you raise for Oglethorpe?
So we raised, and we were on the lower end of what church development usually does, but we ended up 200% of annual pledging, which was great.
Awesome. And what'd your annual campaign do during that time? Because a lot of people are worried that it'll take a dip.
Yeah, and that's the piece that is just absolutely staggering and amazing is our annual giving. I want to make sure I get the numbers right.
Okay, you're gonna look it up.
We had a 60% increase in the number of pledges. That is the number of people or families that pledged.
Impressive.
And we had a 40% increase in pledge amount.
Okay, that's really impressive.
So while we're raising the 200% of annual giving through our capital campaign and being able to spend it on these deferred maintenance projects, we ended up also being able to cultivate stewardship and add more people who were willing to give and participate, and they were also willing to give more increased pledge for the first time, et cetera.
That's fantastic.
Which, of course, helped us to plan.
That's fantastic.
On an annual basis.
So that's a total home run. Total home run. All right, now let me ask you a different, we talked about culture of stewardship. Let me ask you a different question. What do you feel like you learned from your feasibility study? Meredith found your old report, and here's the cover of that, right?
It's beautiful.
Tell me, what did you learn in that process? Now, we think it's one of the 4 parts what you've got to do before you conduct a capital campaign. So the feasibility study, well, let me just ask you, what did you learn?
Feasibility study gave us good data on how invested people were in the community. There was a strong sense of, we trust our leaders. We think the church is moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
We know the financial picture is not strong.
Mm-hmm.
And we're ready to do something about it. And so the feasibility study was the process where church development came in, had confidential conversations with about 30, I would say, families, and given the size of that congregation, and got honest feedback, and then said and then the big piece was, before we even had a plan on the table, people were willing to give a significant amount of financial support.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality for our leadership was, they looked at that and said, if we don't do a capital campaign, we are leaving money on the table.
And that's right. You really would be.
Yep.
You really would
Yep.
be. All right. Now, I've got a question from a participant named Diane, and you can help me with this.
All right.
Let me just read this. We've had an interesting situation with our parish. 3 years ago, we had a capital campaign, $9.6 million goal, raised 7.4 in pledges and gifts. Many donors made 3-year gifts and are finished with their commitments at this time. Now, in the 3 years since, some changes have been made, but none of the improvements have moved forward. So there's no outward signs of change. So this is a potential problem.
Yep.
Now that we're needing to go back to the parish and continue to raise the 2.2 million that they fell short. And then we've got to add some to that, because costs always go up. She's looking to us, asking for suggestions. Now, I'll give you my response, and then Marthame, I'll turn it over to you. Now, my first step, which I want you to talk about your own personal dream team.
Sure.
But my answer to her question is, go back to my dream team, pull together my lay leaders, and do my first version of the feasibility study. I'd go back to my lay leaders, like the people portrayed here. Could be your pastoral council, could be your capital campaign team, and I would be totally transparent. And I would say, here is our circumstance, here's what we need to do. How would you feel, and what would you think if we were ask you for another 3-year pledge so we could get these things done? Now, in particular, the way you design the questions is very important. I would ask, what information do you need? What experience do you need to have before you would be interested in making another pledge? Now, I can anticipate right now, people are going to want to know a lot of information, like, where did that $7.4 million go? That's a really good question.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's going to be trust issues as well. So at this point, a whole lot of information has got to flow back and forth. But Marthame, you've been through this a handful of times. What would your answer be to Diane in that challenging circumstance where she's got to go back and ask for another pledge, and really not much has been done?
That is a tough situation to be in, and I think, Dennis, you've hit the nail on the head in that regard. Obviously every capital campaign is going to be different. There are capital campaigns for which you need to raise all of the money in order to do the project. There's other ones you can do by piecemeal, depending on what kind of projects you're talking about. If this is a piecemeal thing, I would encourage you as strongly as I could to go ahead and make some kind of tangible result evident.
So do something that people can see
something,
and benefit from.
New roof, close the section, pardon our progress, whatever it is, something you got to do. And I think to put the option on the table, which makes church people cringe, but I think it's very, very important to consider, is to think about, is this something that you could take out a loan to make up the full amount and then pay that back? Again, these are things, I think Dennis is absolutely right. You want to have, these are not decisions you want to make on behalf of the parish. You want the parish buy-in on this through your dream team. But these are the options on the table.
Right. Going back to our original concept, consensus, being transparent. Now, a guy named Zach from Villanova wrote a book called Why Catholics Don't Give. And he is a Catholic. It's a Catholic university. And his point of departure was the statistic that Catholics give 1.2% of their income to the church, which is at the bottom of the mainline denominations. Our Protestant brethren in general give 2.2%. So why is the Catholic level so low? And one of the leading reasons was lack of transparent communication.
Mhm.
So Diane, one of the first things you've got to do is go forth with a great deal of information flow outward in multiple streams.
Mhm.
So the old standard is the church bulletin. However, you only get the bulletin when you go to church. One of our churches just did a survey of their membership and discovered that the average person attended church 1.3 times per month. So the average person might not pick up the bulletin where it is presented or announced. So we really think you ought to do multiple streams of it flowing out. You got to collect everybody's email to email blast out. As a matter of fact, we recommend you email out once per week with information. We think you ought to mail out a newsletter, and we think you ought to send out an instructional video to let people know what's going on. The video open rate is a lot higher than text. So you've got a challenge with communication and consensus. All right, now I need to move on.
It's a great question.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And if you give me a call, Diane, I can tell you about a story where, well, I tell you about my own parish where we had 4 capital campaigns in a row for a $20 million project and how we had to deal with delays and asking for more. All right, but let me move on. I know we've got one more minute with you, Marthane. Do you mind talking about St. Paul of the Cross and how you did those 4 things from culture of stewardship, consensus, feasibility study, and dream team, your leadership?
Yep.
Just give us a minute on
and,
St. Paul.
And just so you know, I have a little more time than I thought I did today, but I will.
Okay.
I'll be concise.
Okay.
So St. Paul of the Cross, Roman Catholic parish, a Passionist parish here in Atlanta, and very interesting culturally. It's a 50-50 parish, African American and Hispanic.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I would love to highlight about what we did is this is the second campaign we've done for them. They've had 2 campaigns in the 60-year history of the church, and we've done both of them. So the first campaign, we had to do a lot of work around talking about what a capital campaign was, building that culture of stewardship. This is all predated my involvement with them. The second campaign, what we recognized was, one, was a challenge coming on the heels of the first campaign, and those always have their own challenges to them. Number 2 was that the African-American portion of the parish, which had been the predominant and the wealthier part of the parish, was shrinking due to demographics and age, and the Hispanic community, lower income, more mobile, more transient, was increasing. And so how could we engage the Hispanic part of the community more? In the first campaign, we went with very minimal input from the Hispanic community, a simple feasibility study, had little to no volunteers, had contributions and no pledges from the Hispanic community that ended up being about 2% of giving to the campaign, mostly through fundraising activities and things, very things that church development says that we don't want to do is fundraising.
Right.
For this current campaign, we had minimal input again. We did a full feasibility study where we had few respondents from the Hispanic community and recognized that in the end that had a lot more to do with literacy than anything else. But we actively recruited co-chairs, volunteers, expected and asked for contributions and pledges, had to do a lot of work education around pledges. And we are now projecting a 6-fold increase from that portion from the Hispanic community, which is going to end up being probably 15% of giving and pledging to the campaign. So it was an amazing process of learning where the cultural background was to begin with, having our template as church development and adapting it to a very different cultural approach and doing a lot of education and left with really good results, I believe.
Well, congratulations. You know, any multicultural parish is going to be more of a challenge.
Yeah.
So if you look at the brochure cover on the right-hand side of your screen, we try to do everything in both languages. And I think that helped.
It made a huge impact. Absolutely. No question.
And then in our town hall meetings, we had speakers of both languages.
We had co-chairs who represent the African-American community and the Hispanic community.
Right. So
I got to dust off my high school Spanish, which was terrifying. But
Good
it was
for
a
the
good
brain.
thing, right? Right.
Very, very good for the brain.
Yep.
So you speak better Spanish than me, so you're to be. Okay, so these are two really good examples. Now, before you go, let me just ask you for one more case study. Now, when
Yeah.
you conclude, we're going to shift over and get into some real detail so that the listeners can see how to implement this in their own unique parishes. And then I'm going to call in another person to interview, Daryl Prater, in just about 10 minutes to interview him in a similar way. But tell us about the annual campaign you just finished with Hamilton Mill, where your focus was entirely on building the cultural stewardship. And you got pretty good results, if my memory.
Unbelievable, downright miraculous results. So Hamilton Mill Presbyterian Church, relatively new church in the outer ring of suburbs, or exurbs as we sometimes call them. And they were not ready to do a capital campaign, but they knew that they needed to work on their stewardship culture. And so they worked with church development and with me to implement the stewardship system, which Denis has talked about and you can find out more about. So I basically held their hands as they implemented the stewardship system. And we've been at it for 6 months. We just had Pledge Sunday, and we have had an 80% increase in the number of pledges.
80.
AT.
That's pretty good. That's better than I've ever done, Martha.
It's insane. And half of those pledges were new pledges. They may have given in the past but not pledged. They may not have pledged or given at all, but half of the people or families that pledged were for the first time.
Wow, that's awesome.
And the pledge amount was increased by 60%. 60.
Oh, wow.
60.
Well,
so they've had to go back and double dip and triple dip and ask people for special offerings to make ends meet. They have blown those numbers out of the water for 2018 with just their annual giving ask. So they have already gotten more in commitments than they got in all giving for 2017.
Okay, congratulations. That's pretty fantastic.
Stewardship system.
The stewardship system
works, man.
Does work. Now, I thought my highlight of the year was Batavia United Methodist Church up in Chicago, and I can't remember the numbers. Meredith, can you remember the numbers? How did we do up in Batavia? They were nowhere near as good as Martha's. So we had about a 30% increase in the number of pledges and about a 40% increase in the amount of money. So
That's
I thought
great.
I was good, but I'm humbled at the thing.
Well, and it's one of those, it's one of those magical things. You have a pastor who believed in the vision and trusted.
Right.
It was his first year, so I think he took advantage of his honeymoon period to implement some things. And it was one of those unique committees where everything we did in a meeting said, who's going to do this? And they said they would follow through, and they followed through.
That's awesome.
So those are amazing teams to work with. So yeah, that was tremendous fun.
That's fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's a resume builder.
Now that I'm one of them retired pastors, so.
Yeah. That's now you can be retired.
That's right.
Right on top. Well, Martha, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you spending some time out of your busy day.
Absolutely.
All right, so I don't know how to shift Martha off, but
I'll shut me off.
Technical director. All right, buddy. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Okay, thank you, Martha. That's awesome. All right, now let's shift gears and apply this to your church. Okay. First of all, let's take a look. What does the timeline look like? When you've got to start today, and the way you can do that, you sign up for our stewardship system, which is free. If you just send me an email, I'll send you the subscription, and my email is at the end of this. Or you can send it to Meredith, who's kind of in charge of everything. And she will send you a password, and you get an update every single month. It's a year-round, permanent life activity of the church, and you've got to have a committee in charge of that that's got to meet on a regular basis. And it's not your finance committee. It's got to be a stewardship committee. This will go year-round for eternity. Now, your visioning process, I'm just set to go to a church in Sonoma, California. And the minute I announced to our staff that I've got a client in wine country and there's a vineyard right across the street, virtually everyone volunteered to go to help me. So that's very kind of them. But we're only planning on the month of January for the visioning process. We're going to do a newsletter, a survey, a town hall meeting, a newsletter, And we think that'll do it because there's already such a high degree of consensus. Now, my first church was a church in Oklahoma City. It took us a whole year to get consensus on the vision. So for you, it's going to be somewhere between a month and a year. But you've got to do it, okay? The feasibility study takes between 1 month and 2 months. So let's go with 6 weeks. You're going to ask everybody in the congregation for their input. You've got to summarize the data, create a report with recommendations. And when we do a feasibility study, we compare the results to 100 other similar churches. So you have a context for your results. Capital campaign intense activities take about a 4-month time period of intensity. Then you have 3 years of follow-up that we hold your hand. We help you with your annual campaign every year. And we start a planned giving effort as well, in which every year we ask people to remember the church in their estate plans. We want to have an annual event. So that alone, the capital campaign precedes the planned giving effort. And the planned giving effort usually raises the same amount of funds committed as a capital campaign. You don't get those funds in a planned giving effort until usually the donor passes away. So it might be years, but it's usually the same amount of funds committed. Now, let's talk about the specific things you can do in the culture of stewardship. We created this stewardship system to help churches. So the first thing you've got to do is get a leadership group together to oversee your stewardship effort. I'm going to call that the stewardship team, and we hope they meet monthly. Having stewardship speakers talk about their own journey, their own faith life, how they think about generosity is more effective than having the pastor talk about it. We've got a longitudinal study, a 20-year study from Wichita, a group of 100 churches that just did this over the course of 20 years. Giving as a percentage of per capita income doubled. So does it work? Heck yes. It's 3 minutes. It's the end of church during announcements. The speaker answers the same 3 questions. How has God blessed me? Number 2, how do God's blessings flow through me? In other words, how do I share my blessings? And then number 3, how did my life change once I discovered a life of stewardship? Everybody's story is different, and it's very entertaining. Well, it causes giving to go up because they can relate to the speaker. You've got to engage people in decision making. We think you ought to do 4 surveys per year. I know you think that's crazy, but now SurveyMonkey has made it virtually free to do. We think episodic volunteer opportunities are extremely important. Both Gallup polling and Matthew Kelly have done extensive studies about engagement. And there's a little difference in their outcome, but it's both depressing news. Gallup polling thinks 15% of our members are deeply engaged. Matthew Kelly thinks it's only 6%. That's kind of a bummer. So we've got to find more ways to engage people. And the last bullet is fit for the extroverts of the parish. You've got to have a lot of social activities, which means coffee and donuts after every Mass, just to present an opportunity for people to interact. At the drop of a hat, have a party purely for social interaction.
Dennis, tell them about our stewardship system webinar.
Okay, we're going to do a stewardship system webinar next month where we just walk through what would your stewardship committee do. And we will take that time to click into stewardship system to show people if you're on a stewardship committee every month, click on this tab, download the cut and paste items you can shift over to your bulletin, download the column from your pastor that your pastor can modify, your agenda for the month ahead, checklists, timelines, schedules, calendars, all that stuff to make it real easy for your stewardship committee to develop a culture of stewardship. Now they're going to influence but not be in charge of this next subject, communication. Now, most churches do not do a good job with collecting everybody's email address, but you've got to work on that right now. And you're going to have to do it for eternity. Because not only do you want people to pick up the bulletin, but you want to email it into everybody's home every week. Not only do you make verbal announcements, but you've got to email that information weekly. That is your assignment. Your best communication system is your lay speakers. I'm a big believer in the e-newsletter because you can pack a lot in there. Constant Contact is the best branding name, but you've got to select a method for emailing out to everybody, and these are inexpensive systems, but you've got to pick one. SurveyMonkey is a great way to communicate out and get feedback in return. Now, your pastors are going to hate me when they hear you say this, but the future is video blogging, and they've got to get used to, it can be a 1 minute long, but they've got to do it every week. They've just got to say, here's what's on my mind, here's what's going on. The open rate for an email that has a video is 70% higher than one that just has text. So your communication flow has got to go forward, entering the modern age. Now, before we go too much further, I'm going to patch in Daryl Prater in about 2 minutes. He's a co-worker of mine. We've worked together for 10 years, and he's managed about 50 capital campaigns. And I'm going to ask him to talk about his successes in the feasibility study and then working with leaders. So he'll be joining us in just a minute. Now, before you start, your vision consensus and your financial needs clarity has got to precede ever talking about money. So to make this happen, you've really got to have a facilitator. You've got to have a committee that's a good representative of all areas of the parish, but you've really got to have somebody who is the servant of the group. At a minimum, it's going to take an hour-long town hall meeting, but it could be a whole month. It could be a whole year of town hall meetings. So get somebody who's got 10 years of experience, who's done it 1 million times, and engage them, pay them money to serve the parish in creating the process, and serving the process. The natural components are going to be town hall meetings, surveys, and newsletters. So it's communication going out and information coming back. You are going to have a series of metrics that comes out of it, and you really should narrow it down to the minimum number of metrics as possible. Here I've just pulled some up from a sample vision. Attendance up by 200%, start a youth ministry, hire a youth minister, build a gym and a youth room that we think will cost $1 million. These are sample priorities that might emerge from a visioning process. You've got to do that so that it's not the pastor making a pronouncement that I have made a decision that you all need to give to. The recipe for disaster. So consensus first on the vision. And somebody's got to do a little bit of work to come up with the numbers, what it will cost. But that's got to precede everything. Now, once that is done, the next thing we've got to do is what's called a feasibility study. Now, my friend Daryl Prater has done about 50 of these. And let me patch him in right now and ask, Daryl, are you there?
Hi, Dennis. It's Daryl. I'm here. Yes.
Hey, buddy. Thanks for joining us. Now,
You bet.
So I've got on the screen what a feasibility study looks like. Generally, for us, it's 30 interviews and a mail out to all members. I put 1,000 here on the screen, but it's a mail, email, handout, paper copies at the back of church, link on the website. So we want to have input from virtually everybody. Now, for you personally, Daryl, I want you to just think back to the 50 feasibility studies you've done and tell me about some of the best insights you have gleaned, whether it's a positive insight or a negative insight about a feasibility study that you personally have conducted. So far away, buddy.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to be on the webinar today. I've had the privilege of working with Dennis starting my 11th year. So we go back a few years. And so two churches come to mind. One church with a positive experience, First Presbyterian Church, Portland, Oregon, a downtown historic Presbyterian church, USA. We did a feasibility study about 9 months ago at this church. We did 30 interviews. Our goal was what the theme of Mark Ames' information that he shared, as well as Dennis, is engagement. Our goal was to engage every member of the church, whether it was a personal interview or a survey, paper survey, an online survey. We did 30 interviews. What we learned in the interviews and the survey, I don't think we would have received this information if we had not done this type of engagement. We learned that the young adults in the church wanted to be much more outreach oriented, and they wanted to be much more action oriented. as opposed to how they sensed the church was maybe a little bit more ministering inside the walls of the church.
Mm-hmm.
So actually that prompted us to do a focus group with young adults, and that really helped us to get them on board and engaged and ultimately committed more to the church and to the campaign. We also received about $1 million of unofficial pledges, which helped us to be able to set our overall goal of $2.25 million, and we're approaching $2 million now, and the campaign is not over. So anyway, those are just a couple of insights of how that feasibility study was positive.
That's great. Now,
Another
let me
example
shift and ask you, for a second one, would you mind talking about Holy Trinity? I've pulled up the executive summary on the screen. Now, I feel like this is one of your biggest home runs ever, because it's a debt campaign. In the previous capital campaign, they raised about $1.5 million. And in this debt campaign, did you raise $3.1 million? Is my memory right?
It leveled off about $3.25 million. So we exceeded the previous debt campaign by quite a lot.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Just a bit of history. Over a period of 20 years at Holy Trinity, they expanded their facility both for the church and the school, and some of that facility was shared facility. So they had been in debt for really probably 15, 18 years paying this down. So this was several campaigns later. One of the common themes in the feasibility study was that we're really tired, and if we're going to be able to pay off this debt, we need to get other parishioners and families involved to help us share the load. So it went back to engagement. We had a steering committee, which was a large group. We probably averaged 50, 60 folks on that committee.
That's a big group.
To engage them. It's not like a smaller executive management team that would get down in the weeds, but we wanted to make sure that the steering committee folks, that they were in the know, and that we asked them questions that they could be able to answer without, getting down in the weeds. It was very, very successful.
Great.
So then, with people being on board, and it was a very transparent process, lots of questions and answers, lots of this is what you said, this is what we heard, and this is, we're feeding it back to you through, e-newsletters, like Dennis said, frequently asked questions, paper, information, newsletters, etc., information on the website. And so I think through engagement, through the feasibility study, and then through people feeling like that it was much more of a transparent process, they just really went over the top. So now they're not quite out of debt, but they're under $1 million, which is much more doable than where they were several years ago.
Right. Getting from $4 million down to $750,000 is pretty remarkable. Now, I just clicked and pulled up the detailed recommendations that you created for Holy Trinity. And part of that, I can't remember if it is on this page or a subsequent page, but you made some stewardship recommendations. Tell me about that first year that that first annual campaign that you conducted as part of the capital campaign and annual campaign. Did you have a 12% increase in annual giving? I can't remember now, but it was something like that, wasn't it?
Well, actually, it was a solid 20%.
That's pretty good. 20% is pretty remarkable.
Right, and I always make sure that the numbers are not inflated. That was a solid, I ran the numbers myself, solid 20% increase. So we preceded the capital debt campaign with several months of preparing for the annual stewardship campaign. So again, it was engagement. I know we say that word a lot, but that is really the key to a lot of successful stewardship and fundraising in the church. We had lunches with the pastor with potential top donors, and we did that all through the summer. That was 2016. Then we moved into church-wide town hall meetings. We asked questions like, what are your highest hopes for Holy Trinity? And then there were lots of responses about that. And then what would you like to see happen at Holy Trinity that perhaps, hasn't happened yet, or something like that? What would you like to see changed? And so that prompted a lot of information.
So you really are following our formula of building the culture of stewardship and consensus-based visioning. You did that all the way through.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. If you remember a few minutes ago when Marthane was talking, you're seeing patterns here of what Marthane was saying, what Denis is saying, and now what I'm saying.
Right.
There is that formula that works.
Yeah, that's a lot of repetition. Well, I'm a big believer in best practices. So that's awesome.
Absolutely.
So that the feasibility study resulted in a diocesan approval for the capital campaign. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct.
So I think in most dioceses, they will require you to do a feasibility study. Almost all denominational leaders of all denominations recommend that you do them, but I'm pretty sure that all Catholic dioceses require them. And I remember the church business administrator, Sean Malone, had a lot in common with this gentleman you see on the screen. Not in age, but certainly in charisma. He was very happy the day we got our approval to move ahead with our capital campaign. And it resulted in success. And their director of stewardship, Jeremy Heinen, I think was a real key reason why we were such a success. He was such a professional, attuned to every detail, made sure everything happened on time. He had a highly polished set of communication skills. We were very fortunate to work with such talented people. Now, we've only got a couple minutes left before we conclude, and I want to touch for a minute on the leadership team. And my experience over my 25 years, and Daryl, I would welcome your input. For it to be a success, we've got to have that senior pastor involved. I attempted to do one once without the senior pastor's involvement, and it was a disaster. He hated anything to do with fundraising or stewardship. He avoided us like the plague. And the result is we did not raise much money. We would like to have the church business administrator attending the meetings regularly so that they know what's going on. We'd like to have the parish council or session or vestry leader involved. The consultant, hire somebody who knows what they're doing, has been through it 100 times. If you hire us, we give you two choices on how to proceed. We could be a comprehensive level of service, or we could just be a consultant and tell you what to do. But for that level of service to be a success, you need somebody like that Jeremy Heinen at Holy Trinity who's willing to put in 500 hours of time to do the myriad tasks involved in a capital campaign. But if you do that, I mean, the savings are significant. Most of our churches choose comprehensive, where we really carry the load. But your leadership/management team is going to meet on a regular basis, and it really helps if you have people who are big picture thinkers. It really helps if you have people who are optimists, not pessimists. They're going to meet regularly to oversee both the big picture and the details as well. Now, in our movement towards concluding here in just a moment, you've got to ask yourself the question: is now the right time for us to do a capital campaign? And the factors involved there are the status of the pastor. Is the pastor a well-loved individual? If you're in the honeymoon, that is a great time to do it. Is this their last moment at the church? That would be a question. Are they in the midst of a rocky relationship with their the pastorate over a particular issue? You've really got to think that through. Probably not a good time to do it if you've had a good chunk of people depart the church over some conflict. Now, if you're going to hire a professional firm, I would recommend that you interview 3 different firms. You can see how different firms would approach it. You could do a comprehensive level of service where they become like a staff person, or consulting where they just give you coaching and advice. But you've got to ask yourself, the most important thing is, who's a good fit? If I'm going to hire somebody, which every denominational leader will recommend that you do, you got to ask yourself, who am I a good fit with? Who do I know and like and trust? Because you're going to be spending a lot of time with that professional. Now, we are just about out of time, but I want to just make one last call for questions. You can click on that on that button to share. Okay, here's a question I've let sit for just a moment. What do I need to do to get the stewardship system, your free guide? Okay, if you send an email to church development, so go look back at the announcement for this webinar. If you click and send an email, Meredith in the desk right next to me will be the recipient of that. And we don't want to spam, so we don't send it to everybody. You must sign up for it. But if you send us an email, she'll send you back a password. She'll get you signed up, and you'll receive something in your inbox every single month that's updated. We have a staff person that just does the stewardship system information. Okay, here's another question. You talked about feasibility studies. How often do you recommend that a church not go through with a capital campaign? Well, that's an interesting question. About 1 out of 15. Most recently, our most recent no was an entire congregation was angry at a pastor because he was too on time. This is a report right from the feasibility study. He would lock the doors on Easter Sunday at 9:59. And one of the people I interviewed said, well, I like to be on time too. I was early, but my teenage daughter was not. So she missed Easter morning worship services because she was a minute late. So it would be, and besides that, it was illegal to lock the doors on any building. What if there was a fire? Everybody was so mad, we recommend that they not proceed. Okay, so next question I have here about communication flow. How frequently should we be communicating outwardly? Well, at a minimum, monthly. I recommend weekly email newsletters. Okay, next question, and I know we're out of time. Is a feasibility study absolutely required? In my opinion, yes. Recently, I tore my left Achilles tendon. It hurt a lot. They did an x-ray before surgery just to make sure they understood what was going on before they cut me open and sewed it up. I think that's a standard best practice. If you read any book on fundraising, they will tell you a feasibility study is like an x-ray before surgery or radar. So you don't want to fly blind. So your next steps, subscribe to the stewardship system. It's free. If you contact me, I'll send you our book, The Stewardship System. If you click and send Meredith an email, she will send you a written guide that's got most of what is presented today in that guide, how to plan and prepare for a parish capital campaign. So this is my phone number. Please don't hesitate to call. My name's Denis Greene. There, my phone number and email is there as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Go forth, good luck, and God bless. Bye-bye.